I like this, like, no planning at all.
We're on, yes. No plan, no idea.
I reckon Matt's going to have a great fun with this.
Yeah. Welcome to the zone.
Like, I should stand, like, sort of 45 degrees behind you, and we should sort of stare off into the distance for about 5 minutes.
A couple of broken telegraph poles, a sort of lush, strangely oversaturated kind of crepuscular landscape, some broken trees, grass, an embankment.
We're missing all that, but fortunately, lots of highfalutin and slightly inane intellectual dialogue we can provide.
We have got lots of that in store. It's about buildings and cities. I'm Luke Jones.
I'm George Gingell.
And we are talking about the filmmaker Andrei Arsenyevich Tarkovsky.
Good middle name pronunciation there.
I'm going to really give it a go with all the Russian words here. Born in 1932, died in 1986. And why are we talking about him?
Well, this question came up a lot when I was watching the films. Why am I doing this? This is certainly a set of films which are very prominent. If you are at one of those universities that still has the swizz of like a cinema and architecture course in it, as one of your voters, which most of them are, this sort of stuff comes up a lot. I bet there's a Tarkovsky film or two in it.
He is someone who architects are into. I think that's an excuse enough for us, but I think it's interesting to think about why that is particularly.
It struck me how many people have seen these films. When I say to people that I'm watching them, they've all seen like 5.
Which, given that he is kind of a synonymous with the most highbrow, inaccessible and uncompromising end of cinematic production. Like, whatever the opposite of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is.
It's a meal of just greens.
Well, yeah.
There's no pudding. It's just greens all the way through.
Wonderfully various and strange, and unlike any cabbage you've ever eaten before.
Yes, such variety of massacres.
He's not a hugely prolific filmmaker. He only made 7 films. I think we're going to talk about the majority of them in this episode. We will really get into all of this as we talk about the films. But I think that there are a few things which are worth flagging up as a sort of excuse for doing this in the first place. He's clearly a great innovator in the sort of creation of cinematic space. Like, he makes what he does with the camera and what he does with time in the scene gives you kind of revelatory awareness of space, which is unlike anything else that you really experience in cinema. And you can see why, as architects or people interested in architecture, that really grabs you very strongly.
He's extremely good at constructing images with deep and complex perspectives. It's a sort of an aside almost, but he is so good at constructing this image which involves the kind of movement of the eye through things that you can and can't see over really long distances and long perspectives, which is kind of architectural.
Yeah, he's interested, very explicitly interested in a sort of fusion of like pictorial and cinematic space. Like, he very much set out to be the Leonardo da Vinci of filmmaking. One of the things which he's interested in is how film, in quite a literal way, can create things which have the same sort of power and sometimes very literally reference famous paintings from history. Less charitably, he's someone who's super metaphysical and super interested in like ineffable kind of woo of one sort or another, which lots of architects are very susceptible to. So
I'm pretty susceptible to that nonsense. I mean, that's the oceanic feeling. It's very on brand, I think, in the podcast.
I think that the other thing is that he is someone who really films both landscapes and also interiors in a way that's highly distinctive, in which they seem curiously both naturalistic and sort of deliriously heightened. His interiors are full of the sort of super rich, deep shadows and kind of beautiful glancing light of like Dutch paintings of interiors or whatever. The extent to which any of it is actually natural or not, I think, is kind of interesting to dig into. And I found myself really wondering a lot, like, you'll see some amazing shot from the inside of a log cabin looking out into a green field, and you think, like, how is that achieved?
The Tchaikovsky films are both some of the most interesting from an architectural point of view, and the least architectural buildings, there aren't loads of cool buildings in them, or you don't see buildings in a cool way in Tarkovsky films compared to some of the other films we've talked about, compared to, Blade Runner or 2001 or Akira. But they can teach you a lot more about the tricks of making space take on particular feelings that architects often want to make them take on, like super powerful and angsty, and having a timeless, eternal, made feeling about them. I think architects are well into that, aren't they? I think I'm well into it as well. But also about the fakeness of it. It's very artificial, which is nice for an architect because that's what we do too. You force it.
Yes, it is artificial, but you do suspend your disbelief about it, at least while the film is going on.
That's it. He's brilliant at creating the suspension of disbelief in all sorts of levels, and they're very necessary.
So what do we want to say?
He was born, I don't know, like 10 years after the end of the Russian Civil War, and he died a few years before the Berlin Wall fell, and that means his childhood was in the Second World War, in Stalinist Russia. And that he lived through the kind of cultural awakening liberalization after the death of Stalin, and that was where he kind of got started. Proceeded to successfully or unsuccessfully make art in the Soviet Union until about 1980 when he defected, and we're going to deal with the period from then. And there's a lot of stuff that happens then.
He's very interested in his own autobiography. His family, his parents, crop up again and again in the films in more or less sublimated forms. So in a way, we don't have to do too much of the biography at the beginning because it's going to keep coming up again and again in the films.
In various propagandized versions.
There is this nice sort of story. He apparently wasn't a great student. I mean, he had sort of vaguely bourgeois parents doing...
Massively bourgeois. His father was a very successful poet.
Had his leg shot off in the war, so he had a kind of unimpeachable moral...
And excellent, yes. A medal, war injury, poet...
in the Great Patriotic War. And his mother was... what did she
proofreader and page reader, but also a writer, and very much, I think, kept the family together.
And he wasn't a great student at school, and he went off and spent a year doing a kind of apprenticeship as kind of geologist or something. They were off looking for gold.
Yeah, so he went to do a degree first in Arabic, flunked out, and then his mum managed through connections to get him, a kind of place on this prospecting trip, quite in the Russian Arctic, but like quite far north in Siberia.
In the taiga.
In the taiga, yes. I wasn't sure how you pronounce that word. I'm still not entirely sure. Which basically means the boreal...
The enormous trackless boreal forests. Yeah.
Riding around on horses and bashing up rocks.
And at some point during that experience, which lasted about a year, he decided that he wanted to be a film director.
Yeah. And then he came back, got a place in film school, had a very successful career at film school, producing several films which are put on television in the Soviet Union. And that gave him a position to do his first big feature film, which was Ivan's Childhood, which was a successful at the box office and thought well of in Russia, and very influential abroad as well. Yes. And then that kind of launches his career. And then we're away to the races, really.
From looking at the films and kind of reading about him, you think, here's a kind of lugubrious, brooding dude. But in fact, he was clearly very socially high functioning and good at charming people and getting what he wanted.
Hello, listeners. This is editor Matthew Lloyd Roberts here. We recorded some discussion of Tarkovsky's early films, the films that he made while he was at film school. That discussion is going into the Patreon bonus for this episode. So if you want to hear that, you can go to our Patreon page, which will be linked in the show notes, and pay $3 a month to keep the show on the road. I'm going to play just a brief clip from the Patreon bonus, and then we will go on straight to Ivan's Childhood.
There's a lovely moment as well where he's going through the city and it's very exciting because they're smashing down all the old buildings and building wonderful new Stalinist ones.
Yes, there's a wonderful moment where the big wrecking ball like knocks down a whole wall, which is in shadow. It falls away, and bathed in sunlight behind it in the middle distance is one of those big Stalin skyscrapers. Yeah.
So nice for me. It's so transgressive against what we sort of feel today. Our like horrible conservationist moral compasses are going like, oh, don't knock down the beautiful Victorian thing. And it's just like, smash away dirt and filth and Victorian squalor. Build lovely new concrete tower blocks. Oh, so that was a nostalgic moment.
He gets a chance to direct a feature because it was a pre-existing project. That's the story with Ivan's childhood, isn't it? It was a...
Yeah, so all of those were made in the workshop of his director and his like unit manager in the film school, who was a prominent director.
Mikhail Rom, yeah.
Mikhail Rom. And then this is... I can't remember quite what the story was with Ivan's childhood. I just watched it. We watched it. I wasn't going to watch it. It was the only film that me and Darlie hadn't seen.
It was a very successful short story. And then there was a script. There was another young director who was directing the project, but somehow made a mess of it, or the project was terminated somehow, and it was passed on to Tarkovsky, who at this point must have seemed to be extremely reliable, politically very reliable, you know. There's a cinematographer who he works with up until Stalker called Vadim Yusov, who actually they had worked together on the steamroller and the violin as well. But it's a very important and sort of fruitful collaboration. It must have been a bit strange working as a cinematographer with Tarkovsky, because people who would later take on the role would note that he did slightly eccentric things, like he would want to operate the camera or like be direct from behind the camera. Or
yeah, there was an idea that he got at, which he discovered coming in with these New Wave films, which was that of an auteur, which he rather liked. So before this point, films in Russia were made in a studio system, which you can see how that kind of works in the Soviet country. And he rather liked this idea that the film would be entirely the product of one great mind who would control everything. You know, he doesn't approve of like actors having a method or trying to do anything they're not told to do. He liked this idea of it all being entirely him, which is one school of filmmaking, and that would be a virtue. And that's how he operated all the time. Generally what would happen is, if someone sort of disagreed with him or didn't do what he wanted, he would sack them.
Do you want to say something about it?
Ivan's Childhood. It's a good film. The plotting is very Tarkovskyan in that the short story, it's a bit like Greek tragedy. All the actions already happens and is going to kind of happen afterwards. And it's the bit in between bits of action. It's kind of YA fiction. A tween kind of boy.
Child soldier, really.
Child soldier who must be like in his early teens or a little bit younger. Tragic figure, orphaned in the war, has become a doubtless and fearless scout and is like the most adult character in the film. We meet him like squelching through the plashy marsh and swimming across the river behind enemy lines at the beginning. And then he kind of is picked up by some Russian soldiers, and they don't know who he is, and and the local people don't know who he is, but the high-ups eventually discover he's there, and he's greeted into the fold.
Yeah.
And he's this like amazing super scout child, and he's just done one important mission. The Germans are on the other side of the river, the Russians on this side of the river, the big offensive is coming. And there's a sort of predictable, he tries to, they don't want him to do another dangerous mission because they like him so much, but he must volunteer to get one back on the terrible Germans who have, killed off his family. Mm-hmm. And he's had this hard last few years of being a partisan and all that. It's punctuated by several things. There are the kind of other slighter stories of different people around. There's like the head of the medical department, who's this sort of beautiful young nurse, and various people are trying to get romantically involved with her. There's an amazing scene of like hectoring like officer in this birchwood of these amazing, like all of the birch trees seem to be planted at exactly the same time, and it's just like these white poles, and he's sort of pursuing her through this. All of the adults are kind of childish.
Yes.
And the other thing that's punctuating it is a set of whenever he sleeps, we have a dream of the child. Yeah. And he dreams of his mother, his childhood before the war. But they're very much dreams rather than the actual occurrences. Yeah. And they sort of mean that it has this kind of magical realist thing of his dreams occurring.
Yeah, there's one I remember very strongly still of... there's a kind of cart going along with him and a girl sitting in the back of it, and it's all filmed.
It's like a flatbed truck.
Yeah, and it's filmed in a kind of like reverse vignette thing, so it's sort of white around the, like kind of glowing.
It's
around.
There's a back projected inverted film behind, so they're sitting in the back of this like truck juggling up and down, and there's a back projection of like inverted, which is like looking up into a forest canopy.
Yeah, so it's sort of. Yeah, it's kind of...
Or like solarized or something.
Yeah, everything is kind of glowing around them. And then the back of the truck falls off, and they're sitting on a pile of apples, and all the apples suddenly fall out all over the field. And then from nowhere, all of these horses come in and start eating the apples.
Yeah, it's neat. They're on the back of the truck in this delirious sequence, and he's repeatedly choosing the most beautiful apple for this girl. Yeah. And she's going, no. And then he's another one. It happens faster and faster.
And they're laughing and laughing and laughing.
And they're laughing a bit eventually, although they're like pensive at first. And then it's on a beach, and the back of the truck falls off the truck, but they're not kind of in it anymore. And slowly it discharges lots of apples in a sort of swirling pattern across the beach. And then horses come along and kind of eat the tops off the apples very carefully so they don't eat the sand.
Yeah, no, they've disappeared.
They disappear. It's just the scene of like these swirling apples across a beach.
Yeah, and all the horses.
It's kind of, that's the most magical one.
It's completely magical. What does it mean? I don't know.
Well, it's his dream. Yeah. That's what he's dreaming. Another one, he's dreaming of like killing Germans.
Yeah.
And in the dreams, he's a child. And in the action sequences, there's a scene where like they're being shelled by the Germans, and it's really flashing and terrifying, and the men are all running for cover, and we must find Ivan. He must get down, and he's just standing bolt upright.
Hero child.
He's just like furious at the dastardly Germans. Yeah. There's two other things about it that stick in your mind. One is it has this this is at him as it is most like expressionistic when it comes to framing. Yeah. Tchaikovsky always is very adept at like setting things up in the frame. Yeah. Here they are at its most kind of extreme and graphic. They're
much more sort of jarring, and
it's almost like a silent film in some of its. Yeah. There's a memorable scene of him with a windmill on the horizon and sort of the figure of the boy very early on. Yeah. And there's a bit when he goes through a burnt out hamlet, and it's just the stoves and like a door, and these stoves and chimneys are kind of used to set up these very graphic shots. Really, you couldn't mistake it for artistry. In some of his... Later on, it kind of beds in the shooting style where, although if you look at it, you see it's very carefully set up and kind of graphically balanced. It's not as extremely sort of expressionistic as it is at this point.
Yeah, no, there's a famous scene where you've got all of those burnt timbers kind of pointing inwards so you're sort of shot from within the wreckage of a building, and you see them all kind of pointing inwards, like big spines or something, or cracks pointing inward towards the figure in the center of the frame. Yeah. Later on, his things get slower and slower for one thing, but he becomes also, it's like the camera is very heavy. Yeah. And it means that when it moves, he starts to do a thing where it will be still for a very long time, and then it will move a little bit. Yeah. Or it will move, and then it'll stop. And then you'll forget that it was moving, and then it'll start moving again, or it will move in a different way. At this point, he's exploring a much wider and more kind of destabilized like register.
It can be so graphical, it's almost visually confusing. The delirium of the dreams can become like the delirium of the scene, like with these birch trees. Yeah. It's like so strange and striking the scene.
My memory of it was that it doesn't really have any narrative tension, despite being meant to be a thriller. Because it's too broken up, and you're too kind of unclear about what's going on and where you are at a particular moment. What between like the reality and the dream, and also these scenes which have characters who are not Ivan and where you're not quite sure when you're going to get back to Ivan again. I felt like it was, for me, it was strangely inconsistent in its pacing and tone.
There isn't a lot of plot, but there are reasons why. There are reasons to do with character and the sort of story he's trying to tell about the characters for the things that occur, I think. It's got some funny casting. His love of like beautiful boys and beautiful actors is like one of the soldiers looks like the young Elvis. Like he's got this sort of huge eyelashes, and it's great. He always has great faces in his films. Yeah. They get more rugged as he gets older.
Yes,
there's always
a bit more tortured. Yeah,
the men kind of follow his trajectory through life. It's got a slightly gruesome ending.
Yeah, what does happen?
Well, do you want to do spoilers?
Yeah.
I mean, what it ends in is a big shift of tone. He goes off into the mission, and we just see him go off into the marsh, and the other people like row back. And then we flash into newsreel footage of the fall of Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
We have Ulf Goebbels' real film of Ulf Goebbels' children that he killed with cyanide, like pans across them. The Reichstag blown up. German officers who've killed themselves. Which is kind of gruesome in a kid's film. Or in a film which is kind of like definitely at least a bit aimed at teenagers. Like all these real dead bodies.
Kids love that kind of thing.
Yeah, they do. They go into the Reichschancellery, and the like Elvis character is going through all these documents that have been burnt in the yard of the Reichschancellery, which switches from like archive footage to real. And character's gone, and he's got like this list of people who've been executed, and he's like shot, hanged, shot, hanged, shot, and then one of them is Ivan, who's shot. And there's all this like rebar poking out of the like in this tangled mess above him. Yeah. And it's like a blown out floor, and there's these pages of all of these faces who've been killed by the Germans. Yeah. That's the end.
Yeah. Bad times.
Which actually works, I think, well.
Yeah.
It works like a fable then. Yeah. I mean, Tarkovsky he's never great at character. No. But in here, that is explicitly sort of fabulous. Yeah. And that's how the fable ends. Yeah. And it works kind of politically works. You know, this guy's like, he's like Russia.
Dead without... Martyred, but also kind of lost, out of sight.
Yeah, but saintly as well, and indomitable in spirit.
Yeah, absolutely. And the actor crops up again. He's in the next film as well.
Yeah.
Somewhat grown up. What's his name?
The nurse is Tchaikovsky's first wife. Ivan's mother is Tchaikovsky's first wife. The ideal mother.
I mean, this is sort of set in and around... Well, it's set on the front, isn't it? So it's sort of in and around, like...
Explicitly on the Volga.
On the Volga, yes, okay. He's kind of discovered the landscape that he's interested in, which is water, trees, big expanses of shingle and sand.
Mud,
yeah.
Half land, half water.
This was also an international success. It won a prize at the Venice Film Festival.
A lot of people really liked it. Bergman really liked it. The free play of like realism and the magic of the dreams, which aren't announced, they're just done, is really powerful and effective, and I think that would have been highly attractive to someone like Bergman.
Not quite land, not quite not land either. Should we talk about Rublev? So this was then filmed a couple of years later. He does this project, Andrei Rublev, which is a story about
Andrei
Rublev, who is the most famous Russian painter of the
icons and church paintings.
Yeah. And when was he alive?
Early 15th century. So time, as a bit of like history context, is the time of the formation of Russia, which you might not realise that at the same time as Rublev is finding his faith, Russia is coming into being. And it's the moment when the area had been sort of subjugated by the Mongols, and the Christian rulers had been sort of tributaries of the Mongols and preyed upon by them. The tide turns against the Mongols. Muscovy begins to sort of move towards being the Tsardom of Russia. I don't know where to start with this. It's a beast. It's massive. It's episodic. It doesn't have a linear narrative at all.
Andrei Rublev is in most of it.
Yes, but not all, by any means. It's an incredibly religious movie for something coming out of the Soviet Union.
Yes.
Like, they didn't show this film. This was censored, and like how he could have thought this was going to be put out in the Soviet Union is beyond me. Like, the Vatican published a list of films on religion in 1995 that were its like 10 most approved films on Christianity, and this was one of them, along with Ben-Hur. So perhaps they weren't.
Well, I mean, it is rather like like Ben-Hur. It's also an epic, isn't it?
But it's much stranger. It's really getting into some other aspect of the medieval mind.
Some of the chapters are like epic battle scenes and things like this.
Yeah, quite big budget, cast of hundreds, if not thousands. Yeah,
some amazing production design. I mean, one of the things which is great about Tarkovsky is he does, the sets are amazing. Yeah. They become more and more surreal. At this point, they're just like spectacular and strange and super medieval. It starts off with this amazing scene where these mad monks are launching themselves off in a hot air balloon from the top of a church.
Yeah, it's great. There's a bit when it's like, this is Tarkovsky's film where he gets into a true recreation of medieval Russia, and it starts with a giant hot air balloon made in this like bulbous, bulging, non-spherical shape out of like sheep pelts, all tied together with bits of rope, and like
unbelievable.
A mad monk is like launching it off this church tower, and they're being attacked by yokels. I mean, it's sort of bizarre.
All pulling up in their canoes to sack the place. But I don't even understand. Have they come because of the balloon? Have they come? Because,
It's completely unexplained. And then he breaks free. I'm flying. And then there's lots of like aerial shots of this landscape.
He goes up into the air. You see like a bit of him flying. And then actually he just becomes the camera. And then it kind of cuts into what must be like helicopter shots or like, which become absurdly like he's moving at enormous pace and also covering hundreds of miles. Like,
and then crashes into the ground. You're like, oh, that's sort of ecstasy. And then nothing of this is ever mentioned again.
It's almost the end, but he crashes into the ground. Cut to a slightly slow-mo shot of a horse rolling on its back.
Yes, of course. Yeah. And then
is the next chapter.
And then we meet these three monk painters trudging through a muddy landscape saying where they're going to get a job painting. And then the next scene, I mean, we shouldn't go through the film in narrative because so much happens.
Yeah, there's a great scene in that second chapter where they take shelter with all these peasants who are all in a barn watching a sort of bawdy musician.
Yeah, Jester.
Yeah, and he when they come in, he stops.
He's taking the piss out of like the aristocracy in the church. Yeah.
Then there's a very long scene where they're just like a very long shot where they're just all sitting there. The camera's in the middle of the room and it pans all the way around the perimeter of the room, in the kind of medium shot where you're seeing everyone's faces, and they're all sort of looking across the camera, and there's a soundtrack of singing.
Yeah, and what's happened is one of the monks, Kirill, has slipped out at the beginning of that sequence, and he's informed on the jester, and then some like aristocratic goons come along and beat the jester up, smash his instrument, and drag him away. Yeah.
But you don't quite figure that that's what's going on. But the scene reads as this like hymn to humanity or something. It's all of these people's solemn faces, this unearthly sound of singing, the rain. The
jester goes out and like washes himself in the rain as some commentary on the monks. Yeah. And it's a slightly long lens. It's like, it feels like an 85mm, so everything's slightly flattened out, and it also means that the camera on a tripod can just pan around for ages.
Yeah. The narrative of the film seems slightly to subvert the sort of seriousness of the shot there, because it turns out that actually someone's been out doing this dirty business and getting the soldiers to come and drag this guy away. What seems to be a moment of transcendence is actually a moment of people not paying attention.
Yes, but that's very Tarkovskian. There are multiple Tarkovsky films where three men who like represent different archetypes go on a journey which tells you about their archetypes. Yeah. And in this one, there's Kirill, who's this ambitious but not as talented painter who's very intellectual and sort of systematic. The older painter who's like sort of more straightforward and inspired by faith. Yeah. And Rublev, who is a genius, Christ-like figure, full of doubt.
What are Rublev's doubts? I mean, he has a bit, but he also has doubts about his own work, doesn't he? Like, there's a big bit in the middle where he's been there in this amazing big church interior, really beautifully filmed, full of scaffolding, incredibly white, like whitewashed.
Yeah, it's just been finished. And also, this film is always set up like paintings. This one really feels like Italian 15th century paintings, like Piero la Francesca, but also others. Yeah. A little bit, Masaccio, where all the figures are all kind of like the heads are all at the same point, and the camera is like that. And in the church, I presume the church is just set without a ceiling, and it never looks up, and it's always looking at the same angle. But it means it's got this painting framing. It's really strong.
It is true. It's a technical thing about Tarkovsky that he puts the camera at head height or above. He is always a bit higher than you would expect a camera to be, which produces interesting effects, which we kind of come into a bit later. But he's having these doubts about, he's meant to be painting a Last Judgment, and he feels...
Oh, that's one thing, is he has lots of doubts about the nature of the religion and the state. Yeah. So he doesn't think, he is a slightly communist Christian.
Yeah, he doesn't want to oppress the peasants.
By painting hell. And he also doesn't want to oppress the pagans. There's this amazing pagan sequence, which is like a Bruegel painting in parts.
He suddenly finds himself among all of these very shapely, naked people running around.
Yeah, doing paganism on the magic sex night.
Yeah, magic sex night, all of these torches.
Well, this film is also full of like image metaphors, which are like so clunking. Like, there's massive fist of metaphor. There's a bit when, like, this, like, attractive naked girl is running out in front of the monk. And the monk is, like, she's, like, beckoning him to come into the water. Yeah. And he's like, oh, what shall I do? And then he, like, stiffens his resolve. And he looks down, and the bottom of his robe is on fire. And he pats it up.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I wonder what that could be. Like, a metaphor for... It's an amazing scene. And it's like totally disjointed, the narrative. Like, it has these huge cuts of time.
It's sort of dream sequence, isn't it? Where they suddenly encounter the crucifixion happening on a snowy hillside.
Yeah, in Russia. And it's just one person being crucified. Yeah. He's sort of... Rublev has a vision of the crucifixion,
Yeah, they're all marching up the snowy hill. And King of the Jews written on birch bark on the top of the cross.
All his action shots are like Piero la Francescan action shots. No one has any emotion. The stuff just happens. The guy with the sword like through his head has got the same... And it's not just his facial expression, which is what it's sort of strange in the paintings, but like his unhurried movement and his like... There's no shouting. Everything is calm. Everything is calm as he's being nailed to the cross. Everything is calm as this person is like having his head hacked in with an axe, or... It's like that. There's lots of scenes of the Mongols coming and, doing dastardly things.
Yeah, well, there's a spectacular sort of scene where they've got the Tartars in to go and sack this or that city,
Vladimir, which is where the big cathedral where Rublev's paintings in it is.
Which is a spectacular, like, horse battle. Yeah, they all charge around. People are scrambling up and over roofs and things.
Really strikingly and curiously shot. Again, this strange, like, long perspectives. Lots of doubt and emotions as well are going on in the background.
There are some quite exciting bits. There are lots, like, people running away, trying to hide. Then there's the moment his slightly faithless assistant almost makes it away and then is shot through the heart with an arrow and falls into this lovingly filmed, like, water which rushes over him.
Yeah. There's a lot of dramatic stuff.
There's also a scene which, when I was relatively early on, when they're all on the way walking somewhere, where I think you encounter... There's a way in which the landscape is filmed, which feels very sort of diagnostic, or it feels like this is absolutely him going into a particular sort of groove. So they're all walking in this forest, which is waterlogged, and it's the point. It's the trees and their roots, their kind of root mat, are just lifting themselves out of the water, and then everything else is water underneath, and they're kind of wandering around. It's shot. Well, the kind of standard shot, as you say, like the camera's a little bit up, so you sort of see a lot of them slightly from above, and you see a lot of ground. You don't really see sky. You see like a lot of ground and what the people are walking on. And then intercut with that, there are like super close-ups of not the characters, but the ground. And you see sort of snakes and slow worms slithering around in the ponds. You see sort of this strange way that birch trees rot, because their bark doesn't rot, but the inside rots incredibly fast, but the bark doesn't really rot very fast.
Yeah, the bugs get in under the surface and like eat everything under the bark.
So it turns to powder inside this kind of papery tube. It's quite, yeah.
Yeah, the close observation of nature is throughout the works, and it mesmeric, long. In this one also, the material culture is amazing. This has like amazing material culture in it. He's really dug into his vision of the medieval setting, the sort of slow pacing of what people are doing. But they are just, a lot of the time, they're just doing tasks, work. There's lots of scenes of people stacking wood, or there's a bit where Rublev is like, there's lots of emotional angst going on. But what he's doing is he's taking hot rocks to boil water with tongs. And there's minutes of this. While some philosophical dialogue is going on. In some ways you're thinking, this isn't quite how this is like a painting. And in other ways, it's like, this is a very impressive take on the medieval world, which is not something that's easy to depict at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, amazingly realised.
It's got his wife in it again. She's like the only female character. She's the holy fool.
But, that's a strange character, yeah. There's this famous sort of final chapter where the action switches to like a new character, and Rublev is part of the background, which is all about the casting of this bell.
We've got the struggling artist worker again.
This one is so allegorical, and you really can think like, yeah, there's no way I mean, I don't know, maybe actually this part you could have Sovietized somehow, but it would...
No, this is super. This one I think is the most Sovietizable one of the lot.
Everyone's been died of plague. And there's only one person left in the bell casting village where all of the artisans live, but he says that his father has told him.
Who's like a teenager.
Yeah, well, he's Ivan. It's the same. Yeah.
And in Ivan's childhood, one of the leitmotifs is he keeps coming to this enormous bell.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is shot from above and ringing the noise of the bell, and it's like his emotions are overflowing. And then he becomes the bellcaster.
So this young guy, Boriska, he tells them that his father did divulge to him the secret of how you make bell bronze. And so they got this project to cast the bell, which is this amazing endeavor. They have to create...
It's a huge bell.
A massive one, like 4 meters tall or something. Yeah. You cast it essentially underground. Like you create the mold.
It's all done outside. There's no workshop, there's no buildings. Yeah, they dig a huge pit.
Yeah, and then they have to build it up with special clay and things, the inside and outside of it, and sand and all sorts of different things.
Yeah, it's just like, they used to make them down the road from here till quite recently.
And so there's all, he has to find the special clay. There are various side quests involved in this.
There's a lot of Tarkovsky's view on the artist. There's a very telling scene where this child, people are disagreeing with him, and he has to be strong, and so he has the impudent workers whipped.
Well, yeah, he has his friend, the only other young person working on it has him whipped for exemplary value. But yeah, to cut a long story short, eventually the bell is cast. There's very spectacularly filmed with all of the molten metal shooting down the slides into the hole,
and he's kind of giggling and manic. At scenes he's disaffected and others, and there's a funny one where it's like, this is totally Soviet. He keeps having to screw more money out of the Lord to kind of do the Lord down.
Yeah, we need more silver, because you have to put some silver in the bell bronze, don't you?
Yeah, but he's also like overpaying for things, and sort of funny dynamic, yeah. And he's kind of like a holy fool too. He kind of giggles manically.
So they cast it, and then they have to winch it out of the hole on this amazing, huge wooden scaffold that's built on top of it.
Creaking strings. Again, tension, which is slowly building on this very long scene of winching it up.
And then they have to ring it, which takes... It's like about 2 minutes of the clapper swinging but not yet touching
and like
the bell.
all the characters have gathered round in the film, like in the background. Like there's like the Holy Fool and her like kids who've magicked out of nowhere. There's the Grand Duke. There's Rublev in this huge crowd scene mixed in with loads of other people. And the tension builds.
And it does eventually start ringing and things.
Yeah,
but
and the Grand Duke says like, as an aside to everyone, I'll kill them all if it doesn't ring. So like,
that's good.
He says he's going to kill everyone if it doesn't ring, and then slowly this this enormous clapper is like builds up speed.
Yeah, and then it rings.
And then it rings.
Again, the way the landscape is shot is amazing because they've done it on this big hill where you can see the whole city laid out in the middle distance. So again, it's a very sort of painterly
composition. And over the course of the casting, the entire thing has been turned into like a muddy wilderness because there's been so much like tramping around doing stuff.
But then there's this famous confession at the end, like when everyone else has gone away.
It's a funny shot. Rublev comes walking out into this like wilderness of mud. Slowly, and he stops at this post and leans down on the post, and then you look down, and at the bottom of the post is the bellcaster,
little Boris,
crying, which isn't revealed until you've got to that point.
And he's crying because he never knew how to make the bell. He just made it up as he went along.
And that's the moment when Rublev's doubts are broken, and he realizes he will be a great painter.
But it's also, this is very much how this is sort of Tarkovsky's like mystical view of faith, isn't it? That miracles are achieved by faith. Miracles, like the impossible, is achieved by faith. There's another part in the Bell story where he can't find the clay anywhere and then he falls off a hillside and he finds it by accident. This is the thing which becomes slightly tiresome if you insist on paying attention to the dialogue, which I don't normally do watching Tarkovsky films, but did this time a bit more because I was trying to understand what he was actually trying to say. And he is obsessed with faith, and with the faith of the faith of the hopeless, the faith of the despairing, the faith of the kind of mythicized peasant.
And his own faith, and his faith in himself, and his faith confronting his intellectualism. I mean, his artistic faith.
Yeah. The faith which he likes to portray is sort of not really compatible with the type of person that he wants to be. It's the sort of faith which he...
Oh no, there are different aspects of himself challenging himself. It like bumbles along again and again. It must be. He certainly sees it he always gives the last word to the faith character. After all of this, what we can't talk about will pass over in silence by giving a soliloquy to the faith character. This was an amazing film.
Yeah, it's great.
It's very long and slow. This is the only film I know where the director's cut is the shortest version of the film. He cut it down from 3.5 hours to just over 3. It feels very long.
Initially, he wanted it to be longer, didn't he? But
yeah,
he sort of changed his tune on it a bit.
I think he cut down on the graphic violence. There's a good bit of violence where the cathedral has been sacked by the Mongols and they're looking for where the gold is, and they're like torturing this guy who knows something about where the gold is, and he's going like, you all heathens are going to burn in the pits of hell. You'll be boiled in vats of tar. Then he has like molten metal poured all over his head. It's dragged out by a horse. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff going on. This and Ivan's Childhood are the most gory films.
Definitely worth seeing.
This is definitely one of the masterworks in terms of like scale. Yeah. Like all his feature films are someone's favourite. Each one of his feature films is different and good enough that someone thinks it's the best one. Of the Soviet ones, it feels like the biggest to me. Yeah. The scope is just so big. Yeah. Cast of hundreds, huge amounts of time, culture that is like really alien and distant.
Yes, all these sort of digressions and things. There's that one bit where all these other artisans, the like stone carvers, are wandering through this amazing forest, and then all these men on horseback come up and blind them all. and leave them crawling in the forest. And this is to do. They've been caught up in a kind of feud between two aristocratic brothers.
Yeah, the Grand Duke of Muscovy and his rebel brother, but he wanted them to continue working on. Well, he didn't want them to do any more work on his, but he didn't want them to go and work for his brother, so he blinds them all.
But which ends up with this amazing scene of this bottle of milk, or this like flask of milk, which has been.
I thought it was paint washing from paintbrushes, because it goes to like the next scene is like the assistant washing paintbrushes.
Oh, well, maybe it is. This kind of white like liquid bleeding out into the sort of mossy pools which are all around.
He loves one coloured liquid merging into another liquid. He loves things where there's a liquid which could be reflective, but also a dirty liquid, and viewing things through it at the bottom of it, preferably gleaming slightly.
That's all pretty magic.
Yes. Also possibly highly saturated.
Well, it's justified, isn't it? There's lots there. Yeah. So, I mean, he got in trouble for this one because it's clearly a little bit.
It's super God.
It's all about God, but the like editorially, it's very pro God.
It's totally pro God. You can try and do straightforward Christian readings of them. I think that's wrong. Because they kind of have more, but it's so pro faith, and like he has two sins as a director. He's like super arty and elitist as a Soviet, and I think ultimately they would always forgive him that. And he's super God, and
that was more difficult.
It was more difficult to forgive.
I think it is difficult though, because at some level there's a theory that art should be for the masses, but then there are lots of exceptions to that, like classical music or whatever. And I think that he is trying to do something with film, which is to make it into high art.
Yeah,
and I think that was politically a little bit difficult because
cinema's an amazing popular art.
Yes, it's a popular art, and actually, like the bits of the criticism, the kind of censor and state film board criticism of films tends to mostly be that they're incredibly inaccessible and that people don't understand what on earth is going on.
Yeah, but I feel that could be forgiven because he also has lots of supporters at the same time.
Yeah.
It's not like they give him like equivalent of millions of pounds to make a film. It's so obviously politically unacceptable they can't show it to anyone.
Yeah.
And then they give him millions more pounds to make another film.
Yeah.
Like
he gets quite a lot of chances, yeah.
Yeah. There's a film after Stalker, which like is the end of the Soviet thing. Yeah. And he wrote a script for it. It's from Peter the Great time in Russia, 18th century. He submitted one script. He filmed a version in which he'd taken out all the God bits to the censor. He started filming it with the God bits. A year in, where he'd filmed like half of it, the censors found out and said, you can't produce this with all the God stuff.
Yeah.
And then he destroyed all the footage. He just torched the project. And I think the brick wall was he wanted to do films about God. And that was after all of the other films that we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
They still gave him more money for another big budget
even after Stalker.
Even after Stalker, which is pretty heavy on the religious imagery, but kind of dances around it. Even after that, he did another one. And eventually they said, like, you can't do it. And he was like, right, I'm going to torch this project. I'm going to destroy everything about it. Literally burn it all and leave. But yeah, he couldn't show Rublev.
Yeah, it did make it out eventually. It was shown on television. There were various cuts and things that were made. There was actually the original submitted version. There was an initial director's cut which was super long, which was censored. And then there was another version which was only about 3 hours, which he kind of came around to as being better. And then I think there's maybe a subsequent cut which is based on that one.
He wrote a note justifying it, saying, various colleagues have persuaded me successfully that some of the scenes were overly long. And I recognised some truth in this, which is amusing, given his subsequent filmmaking.
So, what are we going to talk about next?
After that film, he tried to. He wrote a script for a long, indulgent film, all about himself and his childhood, through a set of dream sequences, which he, after the rather controversial Rublev, couldn't get any money to get filmed. So he cast about for an alternative. It reminded me of like Stanley Kubrick, like doing The Shining. He's been given a lot of chances.
Yeah, you just need something
They've
right
all
now.
lost money. He needs to do something that's going to work. And he lights upon this sci-fi story by Stanislav Lem.
Yeah.
Have you read much of his work?
I have read none, I think. Anna's read this one. She said it's really good.
This one was a Radio 4 like midday play,
Oof.
like which are a bit ropey.
So should we just describe the story, because it's got quite a good science fictional setup. So Solaris is another planet, and there's a research program which is going on the other planet. It's an ocean planet. It's entirely covered in this ocean, and the humans are in a sort of orbiting space station examining the planet. Yeah. And the thing which is strange is that the ocean is a sort of single, enormous organic consciousness. It's alive.
Yeah, but they're not sure. All they can see in the book, is like the surface kind of changes and moderates, and they do things to it, and it's clearly got some sort of intelligence, and it seems to like be messing with them in various ways. Yeah. And the focus in the book is that like it's doing various of the things that will happen in the film, seemingly in an effort to communicate with them. Yeah. And they're doing various scientific things to try and communicate with it, and it just leads to an immeasurable, impossible gulf of understanding.
Yeah.
And the people feel like they feel sort of like lost in this universe of incomprehension.
Yeah.
And their kind of inner souls are sort of troubled by that. And in the film, there's a different spin on it, I would say.
Yeah, but I mean, the key thing is that we follow a character who goes to this space station, and while there, he encounters his dead wife, who's been resurrected in some mysterious way out of his own memories by the intelligence on the planet, and she's not just like a puppet. She has some kind of intelligence of her own, and she kind of realizes what's happened to her and kind of understands her own position. And, they have this sort of rather tragic relationship. Part of it is about the fulfillment of these kind of impossible and doomed desires and things. I mean, it's important, I think, to tell the story first, because the film does such a strange job of doing it.
Because I think the story in this one's kind of fun. Yeah. The love affair bit made it boring for me in the middle, because, I'll go into why I think it's so, like, dumb. This one is quite long as well. It's well over 2 hours. Yeah. So it's sci-fi, but it doesn't have a lot of sci-fi elements. It starts... Is it in the, like, strange house in the countryside? A dacha?
It goes on for about an hour before... At least an hour before they go anywhere near the space station. And the scenes in order are a long scene in the dacha where Chris, the astronaut scientist, is staying with his father, and also a friend of his father who was previously involved with
one of the original when they were building this huge space station,
and he's gone a bit bonkers, and they're watching footage of his like debriefing and interrogation by a big committee.
And the
about
footage
what
scenes
happened.
I thought were fantastic. People set this up with 2001 as a comparison, which also has these like debriefing. These ones are so strong. I thought they were like, this was an area where it really superior. The debriefing is occurring. He's got a video of a teleconference. Mm-hmm. A teleconference is in black and white, and it's between like 3 rooms full of like sort of senior bureaucrats and scientists and their silent entourages in the background, who are all these like kind of like, there's like young butts and bureaucrats and people with like funny glasses, like sort of smoking in the background, and like secretaries. It's like this, it's a very plausible setup.
Yeah, it's just like the UN Security Council or something, isn't it? Like
Yeah,
you have one of each type of person around, but then you
and
have
then
their
they've got
teams.
all the wall sitters, all the people sitting against the wall, which is like if you have big bureaucratic meetings, it's like that.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like they're asking him questions, and some people are asking like inane, irrelevant questions. And he's like, oh, this bit's a bit rubbish, we'll skip over this. And he sort of fast forwards the videotape, and it's flashing between different people.
Yeah.
And he's a man who's actually gone down into the surface in like an aeroplane of this planet and gone over the oceans. And he experiences this strange, delirious story, which is way more abstract than we'll see later, of like people who appear to be like made of clay and are like half formed. And then a film shows, and it shows nothing but clouds above this strange ocean. And everyone thinks he's mad, and the project is sort of a failure. And he's trying to convince Chris, who's a psychologist, and he's going to go there and sort out what's wrong with this space station crew, which is now whittled down from like 80 to 3, to see if the project should be abandoned, if they should just like nuke the planet, or if something can be rescued.
Yeah.
And this is occurring in a sort of Russian countryside house where the only bit of technology is this tape machine. There's like video, it's like VHS player.
Yeah.
And the rest of it is, you could almost interchange it with like the autobiographical Mirror film setting. It's like Russian countryside setting, quite lavish, lots of large bunches of flowers.
It's like a countryside house with a big lake and trees. But I think significantly there's this one little intrusion of modernity into it as well, because there's a sort of concrete bridge with a car on it that is always in one corner.
The road and nature are next to each other. Chris is obviously very emotionally troubled. He stands out in the rain. He goes for a walk every day on his own, and he stands out in the rain, letting himself get wet because he's overwhelmed with his big emotions. The rain is classic Tarkovsky rain, and it's clearly a guy with like one of those big hose pipes with it's like it's just in one little spot, and it's coming in kind of parabolically, but really heavy.
Just to say something about the way the film is paced, which is very strange.
And very slow.
Very slow, very strange. There's this enormously long scene in the house, and then there's a very long wordless scene where his father's friend is driving a car on the motorways in Tokyo. It goes on for about 5 minutes and has no purpose at all.
He's not there. Like they've really like sent a crew out to Japan to like film big roads in Japan. And they've like mounted a camera on the car, and they've driven around like the most dense bits of Tokyo and Osaka traffic.
Yeah.
5 minutes of that. And then the friend, I have no idea why it's the friend. Why isn't it
I don't know.
Chris?
It doesn't make any sense, does it?
Because it's like a long journey, and it corresponds to the journey Chris is about to take to the space station, and it would kind of make sense.
But it's actually his father's friend.
But it's actually his father's friend.
And his father's friend's son, who's a young boy who doesn't feature in the story otherwise. Yeah. And they're just driving around with the sort of shadows of the overpasses going over them.
Yeah, and these like cool, I mean, the footage is super cool. All these cool new buildings, Tokyo in the 70s, and like all this traffic. Very strange. Yeah. I quite like that bit.
Eventually, they do actually go out to the space station. There's a scene in this, you were saying about the rain. There's a couple of bits which are like super condensed, pure Tarkovsky goodness. There's like the shots down into rivers and lakes with kind of waving pondweeds, which go on.
That's it. It starts with minutes the film and minutes starts and minutes. With several minutes of first like pondweed and then like seagrass waving in a river. That's the first like 4 minutes of the film.
And then also there's this amazing rain scene where Chris is outstanding in this incredibly heavy, as you say, it's sort of like being in a car wash or something, this rain.
Yeah.
And he's standing out there in his leather jacket.
Getting all wet because he's got a lot of emotions.
And it sort of zooms in and in and in on this teacup and a sort of partly eaten apple and some cake or something, which are all on a tablecloth and which are like filling up with water. It just goes on and on for ages.
Yeah, there's another scene of like some things blowing around on a table as well. in big winds. The sci-fi elements are condensed into about 2 minutes, most of them, which is you see like a background of stars and then a light flashes in the middle and then his face is superimposed on it, and that's the interstellar travel. And then there's the space station, which is a cute little like 2001 model of a sort of like circular space station with lots of globes, and that's sort of like zoomed in on, and then he arrives in it. And then after that, we're in this set in a film studio on the space station. And the space station, something has clearly gone very awry. Everything in the space station is circles and arcs, which goes, and a lot of the filming is like a camera panning around the circle from a fixed position. The space station was clearly originally set up kind of like submarine in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It's like a mixture of like sci-fi and sort of Victorian gentleman lodge, and it's all gone a little bit horror film. Everyone's gone. He finds one scientist who is like gone totally ragged and won't talk to him, and like seems to be like hiding someone in the back of the room, and he says, "Why don't you have a wash, come back in half an hour, maybe tomorrow, I'll tell you something about it. The guy you were coming to see has killed himself.
Yes.
You'll find him in the morgue. The other guy's still here. He probably won't want to see you, though." And that's kind of strange. And then he goes to his room, which is like a mixture of sci-fi and like... He's got like a little suite. It's quite nice. It's got a little bathroom, like a sci-fi table, some Bruegel prints on the wall. He eventually kind of manages to knock on the door of the other scientists who won't come out, but like something mad is going on in his room, and he'll eventually like come out but won't let him in. And it's clear that people are like having apparitions of some sort of humans. The first scientist he meets is kind of like a poet kind of character, and the second one is like a scientist again. This has already happened in Rublev. It's going to happen again in Stalker. You have this kind of three figures.
We'd be remiss if we didn't say something about the experience of listening to dialogue in, or like just a dialogue such as it is in the Tarkovsky film. I've got a bit of the script here. This is a bit from early on. "I can understand how Professor Messenger feels. I understand him, but let's take a look at the road we've travelled. Solaristics is exactly where it began. Years of work have been in vain. Everything we now know about solaristics is negative and has come to resemble a mountain of disjointed, incoherent facts that strain credulity. We're in exactly the same situation today. Solaristics is degenerating, but what we're talking about is far more serious than just the study of solaristics. We're talking about the boundaries of human knowledge. Don't you think that by establishing artificial barriers, we deliver a blow to the idea of limitless thought? By limiting our movement forward, we facilitate moving backwards. I nevertheless repeat my question. What do you mean by saying that the report of my observations in almost no way corresponds with the reality? I saw everything with my own eyes."
He means, and it's actually, what do you mean by almost?
Yes.
Or almost exactly corresponds. There's a big argument about whether it almost or completely corresponds to reality. Doesn't correspond to reality. And all the dialogue, well, not all, but 95% of the dialogue is like that. It's long discussions on the nature of truth, or it's long discussions between like a scientific archetype, a poetic archetype, a believer, a non-believer, about the nature of truth and belief in, and in this case, it's all wrapped up in like sci-fi language. And it goes on for hours and hours. So the people, when they come to this station, the planet kind of projects something from their past, or something is kind of brought out of their mind, and it's clear it's getting better and better at it. Like when the guy first went there, it could produce these like strange things like people made of plaster of Paris, which are like shadow dreams, and now it seems to be producing people who are more and more accurate representations of themselves. But the reason Chris has been so sad is that he's a tragic character out of like a Emily Bronte book or whatever, and he's had this relationship with a woman, like he was emotional and she was emotional, and for some reason he decided to leave her, and she said she was going to kill herself if he left her, and then he talked about it for a bit, and then he decided he didn't love her, and he went away and she killed herself, and then he came back and it was too late, and that's all happened previously, and it's dumb and tedious. I don't know what you thought about that. It's like, I feel that there's a lot of suspension of emotional belief to make this film work, which is that this relationship is clearly like out of a Gothic novel. The woman is someone who is like basically killed herself, one, because she can't stand the idea of not being with this man, and two, to like show him, like teach him a lesson. Yeah. And he's just like apathetically left someone, because of some argument with his mother, who's clearly got like serious mental issues or whatever. It's not real people, it's camp bad fiction. Anyway, she's revivified. Yeah. He sends her off in a spaceship, has a lot of emotional turmoil.
Early on, he keeps trying to get rid of her, and she keeps resurrecting.
Another one keeps being resurrected.
But later on, she keeps trying to bump off herself in various ways. There's a bit where she drinks liquid nitrogen or something.
Yeah, liquid oxygen. It's very specific.
She's completely frozen and dead, and then just comes back to life again.
This happens a few times in the films. He likes the love interest to be writhing on the ground in a slightly sexualized way, in a state of both physical and emotional turmoil for a while, and the camera sort of likes watching that. So she's like brought back to life again and defrosts and does some wriggling. I'm being a bit down on it, but it is also effective. Up to this point, the bit in all the films I thought was worse was the middle of this film where they're building up the relationship. And I was just so... I think I'm really repulsed by the like high emotional tension that's meant to be like interesting about these two people who, if they were real people, would clearly be absolute shits. They both behaved like so badly.
Yeah.
Like if you're in a relationship with someone and they're like threatening to kill themselves if you leave, there's something seriously wrong. You both need to like, there needs to be a lot of truth telling. Yeah. You should probably both seek help. No one should be killing themselves over a fella, especially not like in their 30s.
Yeah. Oh well, the casting in terms of age is very strange though, isn't it? Because he looks as if he's the same age as his father. Yeah, and his mother sort of seems to... They have a weird bit where you also have, a memory sequence where he's a boy with his mother, but his mother is kind of the same age as his wife.
Well, the reason for that is, he says, Tarkovsky has some mummy problems. We'll explore this later.
Yeah.
He says that she's been reincarnated as looking just like his mother because the memories of them have kind of been combined because of something in his relationship.
Right, okay. But also, yeah.
And they talk about that.
But at the beginning, also, his dad is the same age as him.
Well,
like, he's meant to be the son.
I think he's meant to be like in his like 40s and his dad's meant to be in his 60s, but they both kind of look like they're in their 40s.
They look exactly the same age, yeah.
I know, they might have got on with it. Yeah. People did get on with it.
They did
then.
A bit, but there is something a bit weird about it all.
Yeah. And then his mother, like when she's a grown up, like with the father, looks totally different. Yeah. It's played by an actress who doesn't look anything like the young version, who looks just like... Is any of them his second wife?
Oh God, I don't know. Where does he get?
I don't know.
He does get with this. Yes.
I don't know. That might be later.
He switches wives around this time. No, he divorced his first wife a bit before this.
Yeah, I was wondering if one of the minor characters was his second wife.
Yeah, he got together with his second wife a bit after. He met her on Andrei Rublev, Larissa. So, and then had another child. Yeah.
Yes, his first one was named after his dad, and his second one was named after himself.
Yeah, I don't find Solaris as interesting in the way that it's filmed.
There's a couple of pretty cute moments. Yeah.
There are a few really strange and memorable moments, but for the most part, I don't think he shoots or lights particularly like the enclosed spaces of the space station in a very memorable way. Compared
the lighting of most of the space station looks like an empty art gallery.
Yeah, it's not. It's very even and it's not very atmospheric.
It doesn't feel like a space station at all. It feels like a studio, except for that. I quite like the weird library in the middle, which is the kind of like Cluedo drawing room where things happen. And it's all like wood panelled and full of objets d'art and books that people can grab so they can make long portentous quotes from like Dante or whatever.
There's some paintings in there as well.
Yes, there's a whole load of mainly Bruegel paintings. Hunters in the Snow, The Tower of Babel, Icarus.
There's the scene at the beginning, he spends a lot of time pacing around this lake looking into it, which is where all of these shots of the pondweed come from. And then at the end, you end up with this strange scene where he seems to have returned to the dacha to see where his father is. But there's this sort of surreal thing happening, which is that now the rain is on the inside of the house. He keeps looking in through the window and it's raining on the inside, and then he's kind of kneeling down and like hugging his father, and he's sort of despairing, and then there's this aerial shot which is pulling out, and you realize that the house is actually another one of Solaris's illusions. He's on a little island.
Yeah,
in the
there's been a
middle of
lot
the
of
ocean.
foreshadowing that. They've like talked a lot about how they've like broadcast his brainwaves onto the surface of the planet, and now it's forming islands, and he's like, will I go down or will I return? And like, this is after the revivified lover has finally worked out a way of killing herself and sort of removing her existential problems of being a fake person or a real person or a real fake person or a fake person that's becoming more real. And then, yes, he sort of returns home, but you can immediately see it's another kind of dream vision home because the steaming water going all over his dad. Yeah. And then you see that the dream is a dream of the island, and that he's kind of gone further into the dream, having had this experience with his late wife. I actually didn't mind the end. I quite like it. Was the middle lot I found.
Yeah, I quite like the very end. It drags a bit on the space station. It's got various bits which I guess are interesting if you're a Tarkovsky completist. And there's the first appearance of the floating scene.
Yes, yeah.
People or couples
like,
floating.
We're going to shift orbits, and there's going to be 30 seconds of weightlessness, and there's what's clearly meant to be the 30 seconds of happiness in the relationship when, the unbearable lightness of being takes hold, and actually he hasn't quite technically, I think, mastered it at that point. It works at a metaphorical level, but it doesn't work. It's a bit tell, not show.
It's a strange performance as well. The lead guy, this guy, Donatas Banionis, who's a Lithuanian, I think, yes, who is super lugubrious and really massive. He looks like a water polo player, doesn't he? He's got
Yeah, big shoulders. Big face. Like, he wasn't what Tarkovsky wanted.
There aren't a lot of other actors like that in his films.
I think they had a falling out. He's a charismatic presence.
Yeah, very charismatic.
But it doesn't work.
Yeah, because there's nothing happening.
Yeah. I mean, stuff like... I quite enjoyed watching it. It wasn't one of my favourite of them. I like the beginning and I like the end. Like, Tarkovsky always, actually, is an amazing filmmaker, but he doesn't have any emotional insight. Yeah. He's emotionally kind of adolescent. Or something. Like, it's not...
Yeah. Well, should we go into Mirror? Because Mirror is this very experimental film which he made afterwards.
So Solaris actually got released as well in the Soviet Union and did sell some tickets and things.
Premiered at Cannes. It was nominated for the Palme d'Or. It had a relatively narrow release, but it did sell quite a lot of tickets.
Which is more than you can say for...
the one that came after.
Yeah, a lot of the other films.
I mean, the thing I was going to say about Mirror is this is sort of where the technique and everything is kind of mature. Like, you know, Mirror onwards, there's a really particular way of doing things. There's a sort of potential of how to set up the camera, how to move the camera, this assurance in sort of bringing together these different kind of poetic elements. There's a way of using mist, of using water, of using fire, of using like shadow, filming interiors. I mean, the scenes just get longer and longer and longer the longer he's making films, actually.
But I also feel it's like the end of some sort of exploration. Yeah. Before this time, he's trying out very different things. Some of the approaches are always there, but we're now getting more steady state, where the trends, instead of like experimenting in different directions, he's starting to become a bit self-aware and a bit like...
This is how I do stuff, yeah. Which some people kind of like and some people don't. I think I like mature Tarkovsky, and actually I think I like the films more after he's worked things out. But I think some people feel like, particularly towards the end, he becomes a bit of a cliche of himself. So Mirror it's kind of autobiographical.
like an abstracted autobiographical. I would say it's a set of his memories from stages of his infancy, childhood in the war, also his current self, all sort of portrayed somewhat magically as memories, which are also interspersed with kind of grand historical events of the time showed in newsreel. The different periods sort of discuss different key relationships.
Yeah, there's the central character is called Alexei, and then he has a son, and it's also about his father, and so it's him and his relationship with his wife, and also his father and his mother.
Him and his relationship with his ex-wife.
Yeah, his ex-wife.
He's doing this classic, slightly problematic thing of having had a breakup, like novelizing it and making a lot of that.
And it's like non-sequential.
Yeah.
And it is also, there's one thing which I think really for me pushes it into the domain of the extremely confusing, which is that two of the characters are played by the same person.
His mum and his ex-wife.
Are played by the same.
Merged into the same.
They're played by the same person, who is what's her name, Margarita Terrakova.
Yeah, who's the overwhelming screen presence.
Yeah, who's completely magnetic.
Yeah,
but
and he really is enjoying being the camera, watching, putting her in like emotional situations and like watching her response.
I think we should talk about the settings of this because it's important.
Very much.
So there's the setting of his boyhood. So early on, there's a scene. Well, one of the early scenes is in this little house in the countryside, which is the house where he's living with his mother, and they're waiting for his father to come back.
It's now the Tchaikovsky Museum.
Yeah, and it's this amazing bit of filming of landscape. You've got this sort of slight hillside going down, all covered in grass, and she's sitting on a fence, and you have this sort of angle shooting a little bit down, lots of them, lots of ground. This man who isn't his father, played by this actor, Anatoly Solonitsyn, who is in a lot of the others, that sits on the fence as well, and the fence breaks and that kind of thing.
Yeah, he's kind of chatting her up. Yeah. She's smoking a cigarette.
Yeah.
She's not into it. He's the neighbour. But it's also got a great thing of like his long walk from the distant background in a kind of arc through landscape to the mother.
You also have like the sort of unreal nature as well. The thing of, at a certain point, a wind sweeps across the grass and ripples all of it. Yeah. Which I think must be achieved by having a big fan.
I think it might be a helicopter.
Do you think?
It's too big. It's really big.
I don't know how you would do it.
I would have a helicopter taking off.
Yeah.
Given that he was using them, it's got that pattern of like ripples.
This is where the moments of real like sublime beauty start coming in. The way in which the interior of these wooden houses in the forest is filmed.
Super beautiful.
It's exquisite. So you have these intensely like rich, dark, shadowy interiors.
Everything is like this beautifully planed, super flat wood. The wall, floor, ceilings. The interiors are dark. They're full of like quite beautiful and tasteful pieces of like early 19th century furniture, huge bouquets of flowers in beautiful vases, but sort of sparse, everything tasteful, but all shadows and flickering lights and reflections of polished brass.
Yeah, or also you have the outside quite a lot. And the other thing which is that he's developed the way of moving through these spaces. So you have these camera movements which move sideways, move forwards, where there are
thresholds.
You have people doing things.
The action is happening in the next room. You're in one room. The action is happening in the next room, and you sort of
go
looking
past
through
them
a door,
whatever.
but also looking in the room you're in.
There's a technical question I had when I was watching this, which is that I can't quite understand, because one of the things is that you'll go from inside a very dark room, but which is apparently naturally lit, and where it's lovely and shadowy, but you can see what's going on, and then you'll go over to the window and look out of the window, and that's a thing which you can do with your eyes, but which are actually doing with if you've ever tried taking this, like a couple of pictures like this, it's incredibly difficult to do because the outside
It's not, and they're not like slamming the aperture either.
no, because the outside is actually like 1,000 times brighter than the inside of the room. It's not.
Yeah,
it's
or
not.
100 anyway.
Yeah, it's not a thing which you notice because your brain is wonderfully deceiving you in all sorts of ways. But it's
several stops brighter.
And I don't quite understand how they do that.
I guess he's just lit it and stopped it to match.
There's something very precise and very clever going on between him and the cinematographer.
There's that famous scene in The Passenger at the end.
Yes.
Where they do that, which I think was just achieved by doing it at dusk. But I don't think that's what is going on here. I think he's just lighting it like, like when you light day for night, you just like make it brighter and then...
It seems to be incredibly like beautifully natural, but when you think about it a bit, you think actually
everything is super stagey. Like all these places are full of tracks for these cameras to move around in.
Yeah, no, and there's some nice footage which I think we should try and post of him filming his penultimate film Nostalgia, where you see him setting up them. They've set up a relatively short scene, which actually I think is about 12 seconds long or something,
which is in slow-mo, and I think the filming of which is like 3 seconds. Yeah.
The classic thing is that they would prep a shot for like a day or longer, 2 days. They would work through absolutely everything and they would do one take and that they would get it.
Yeah, something I like is he comes out of the old sort of Soviet school where film stock is really valuable and you don't take things twice very often. So he's not like one of these people who's trying to like do it again. No, it's like once or twice maybe. They had to shoot the end of The Sacrifice twice, which is kind of funny because they mucked it up, which involves burning down a house. So they burnt it down, cleaned up the site, built it again, burnt it down again.
So I think, those kind of scenes, I think there are different time periods in The Mirror, but the scenes, particularly in the past, they're the most beautiful, and they
are explicitly not him recreating it. They're his memories. Like, the houses are way too big and rich. The landscape is too, like, in dappled autumn, but I mean, not dappled autumn, it's like verdant spring, but the image of, like, there's a point which is clearly a very vivid memory for him when a neighbouring barn burns down. And it's like this sort of silent image of a thing burning down. It's very good at conjuring up a memory rather than a reality.
And that's a very particular example also of how he uses sort of movement through space, so that there is something unemphatic about it. Like you follow the boy through the house, you move through the house, and then you emerge into a point where you're looking, there's rain, and then the barn is burning, and you kind of arrive at seeing the barn, and then you see the mother looking at the barn.
And the scene is like what you eventually, well, not maybe eventually, but the first time you see it burning is you're on the kind of veranda. Yeah. You can see a potato patch surrounded by forest on one side and a path and his mother and the fence, and that goes up like the neighbour's garden, and you can sort of see a fire through the trees.
The thing which is happening is very dramatic, but it is set up in a way which is extremely static, and it's arrived at through a movement which is incredibly deliberate and slow. So the drama would come out of the abruptness of it, but there's no abruptness of it. You arrive in this extremely deliberate, extremely careful way at this moment where you are looking at this dramatic thing happening, but actually it's just an image of kind of transcendent beauty.
Yeah. And it starts with there's an argument. His mother says, "Don't make any noise. There's a fire with the neighbours." And then you see a sort of clarified or archetypical version of his view.
Yeah.
But it's not like his view like Steadicam. It's like the opposite of Steadicam.
It's tracking, yeah.
Yeah. But super slow. Yeah. What must have been a couple of seconds spaced out, just this long shot. Yeah. It was really good, that scene.
It's beautiful. And the fact that you encounter the moment where you see the dramatic thing happening is set up as this amazing, beautiful picture. It's a thing happening in its place within a composition.
He has never so far actually failed, really, in composition. Yeah. There's points in Solaris where the lighting isn't great and things like that. Yeah. But the compositions are, and they're becoming more mature. Sort of, Andrei Rublev is the last one where they stop being, where they're kind of, like, expressionist.
I don't know, there's a tiny bit of that in this film. In the scenes with his divorced wife, in the strange apartment where it's his son in the strange apartment in the 60s or something. The interiors reminded me of like Polanski's Repulsion or something. Yeah. They're these sort of hysterically heightened and everything that has these like lurid and horrible colours and things.
Yeah. I guess I was meaning just the framing. Yeah. The thing of like weird expressionist sets never goes away. Like you enter these like weird dream worlds and suddenly everything is like the room is full of water. The walls are made of like some incomprehensible gunk. Something is bright red.
Yeah, but the way they're filmed is never sort of expressionist. It's like...
Yeah. They're like very careful scenes, but they're more like careful scenes that are disguising the ways in which they're not natural, rather than flaunting them.
Yeah, I think those are my favourite bits of The Mirror, those early bits. There are kind of dream sequences, and there are...
There's a very famous one of which happens quite late on, of I think his mother, although it
could be his wife.
Like
Who
his
knows?
wife, I think it's his mother. Like floating flat above her bed in a room where the walls are like the walls of some ancient trickling fountain of water, like moss, and she's just like still floating in air like an apparition.
Those ones, so they're kind of, most of it's colour, but it's intercut with these black and white ones, which are where he's using black and white for these very deep, dark kind of shadows.
Which he's been doing throughout. All the films have the play of... After Ivan's childhood, every film has a play of colour and black and white, where the colour
But he's
means
using
something.
it to move into this other register, which he then does very deliberately. There's another one of his mother washing her hair, which is sort of one he's talked about.
It's a funny one, isn't it? It's kind of like Klimt painting.
The other bit which I really like is there is a scene which is about his mother sort of living her life as a person working in the publishing house, where she has to go running through the rainstorm because she thinks...
How did you think he was going to get away with that one as well? That one is super anti-Soviet.
Well, let me say what it is. So she's running because she thinks that she's made some kind of mistake in something that she's meant to have been proofreading. Could you work out what the mistake was that she thought that she'd made?
Yeah, a bad word.
A bad word had slipped through she thought that she'd let a bad word slip through in some book of poetry or something.
Yes, but really it's revealing her nervous state because her husband has left her. He's got a weird thing where there's always this like slightly sexualized mother figures, and then he has the mother as the lover as well. Yeah. And there's a thing with the father is this kind of distant character who is kind of yearned for and silent
and barely seen. He doesn't turn up very much. Yeah.
But like he uses his poetry all the time. Yeah. And this film has long bits of his father's poetry, which also features in Stalker. The periods are his infancy, when he's like 3 and he's evacuated, or perhaps he's 5 and he's evacuated with his mother to the countryside. She is like a lone woman whose husband's kind of left her and she's got to hold it together, and there's trouble with the like slightly socially above them neighbours. Then there's him going through the early stages of like military training as like a 12-year-old or something. Yeah. Which confusingly he's played by the same actor that plays his son in another bit. And there's sort of stories about like a boy who's had a lot of trouble, obviously, in the war. The shooting range is just like the things they use for shooting people. Yeah. You know, that like sloping wooden floor.
And they've had their shooting instructor who, there's this slightly grisly detail that under his cap, he has one of those like plastic things that you have to wear because he's lost a bit of his skull. Yeah. Anyway, there's something.
Various japes. Various things happen.
Yes. That is revealed at a certain point.
It's powerful sort of like short memories.
It's kind of amazing that this got made at all.
It's effectively emotionally evocative. If you can succeed in suspending the emotional disbelief as well of like, this guy's doing this. It's super indulgent.
Yeah. For me, it is really so non-linear, based totally around memories, set in various different parts of time which are all intercut together. Like, I can go with all of that. The point where you start casting the same actor as multiple different characters is the point where,
But it's
for
all
me,
about,
it becomes...
but it's all about, but one of his leitmotifs is making his mother into his lover.
Okay, but at that point, it becomes impossible to understand what's going on. And
for me, a bit too much of him, the camera kind of enjoying an emotional response of her between laughing and crying and emotional overwhelmedness, which is something he really likes watching in his mother and his ex-wife.
Yeah.
Being ventriloquized. It's a very strange thing to do.
he does also put in lots of things which tell you about his kind of artistic formation and the things which matter to him as a filmmaker. So he has a bit where he's reading... He has like an art book
He steals from the school library a book on Leonardo.
Yeah, so he's got this Leonardo art book with all of these pictures which he's reading in the woods and sort of studying very closely. And then there's a great scene at one point which is a kind of restaging of Bruegel's Hunters in the Snow, but with lots of little boys sledging. So it has this sort of characteristic, slightly compressed background.
All in black against white snow.
People in like right in the foreground, and then lots of people like a very busy background with them sort of disappearing and reappearing. I had my own little mirror moment with this because I remember my grandmother's second husband had all of these books of things like Bruegel and everything else. He in sort of retirement, the thing which he liked to do was to just sit and look at them. And then his eyesight got worse and worse, and he had like a sort of magnifying glass, and he'd be like looking at them with the magnifying glass in this way, which is rather like the camera. I sort of found myself back.
I was thinking about like why Bruegel. I can see several reasons why he's a kind of perfect sort of artist for Tarkovsky and the Tarkovsky vision, which is that his paintings are breaking out of like the classic genres preceding. Yeah. They are humanistic depictions of life with often clear but sublimated like spiritual messages. Yeah. Hidden messages, hidden in scenes. Or like hidden in the background. I mean, some are more obvious than others. And they're also transfigured into sort of dream state Holland. Yeah. And he's someone who is trying to pick out the soul of people and also how that connects to like the divine or something more complicated quite often.
Yeah, it's another thing which he's interested in trying to do with the camera, which feels kind of natural, the fact that something can be going on very close to you and very far away, but which again, in fact, technically requires him to be quite clever about how it's done. The camera has to focus in a way that
He's very good at making films. They're great to watch. They're even greater to have just watched.
Magical moments, yeah.
And like, it's a reference to, sure, that painting, but it's also clearly some strange memory or strange idea or dream someone's had. Because what happens is a boy's standing there and a bird comes and lands on his head and he sort of slowly reaches up and picks up the bird. That feels like something between a parable and a like strange dream memory. Or perhaps a real one, I don't know. Perhaps that happened, but it's more like the way it would feel than what it would be. It succeeds in having qualities about it that are like childhood memories because it makes me think of childhood memories, and it clearly made you think of a childhood memory as well. I think these films are better watched not all at the same time because I think you get an overload of his big Russian heart and how many emotions he's feeling. And I'm like, why do I care about this man's emotions? I care about his brilliant talent.
So this is the end of the first part of our discussion of Andrei Tarkovsky's films, the ones filmed in the Soviet Union before his shameful defection to the bourgeois capitalist West.
You will have noticed that we haven't carefully planned this out, which I apologise for, and so this is not a particularly brilliant point to end, but I think even for us it would have got too long. We have recorded all the rest of it, so it is coming.
So it looks like this is going to be a 3-parter. I hope you like it.
Listeners, as ever, follow us on Instagram at about_buildings and pray for the undying soul of the editor for having to put together 4.5 hours of this material.
I'm sorry, Matt. It's very bad behaviour.
We are none of us free from sin. And if there wasn't any suffering, there wouldn't be
no
any
hope.
That might be out of sequence. That might be something we're going to get to in the next episode.
It can be foreshadowing.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very
Good
much.
night.
Фари. Прости, милый, я немного задумалась. Что-нибудь случилось? Нет. Ничего. Все в порядке.